thank you very much, Dr. Jammine. Thank you for joining us today. It's a privilege and an honor to have you. And so much so, we've really prepared. And in reading your profile, there's just so much information in the profile that I thought, you know what, I'm going to take you back to the days of yesteryear and go through step by step, and that will just give us an introduction into people understanding who you are and where you come from. So you matriculated at Pretoria Boys High. I mean, that's quite some time ago.
Yes.
Then you did your BSc Honours in Mathematical Statistics at the University of Witwatersrand, and you represented Wits and Transvaal under 20 in rugby. I mean, that took you back some time.
That's a long time ago.
And then in 1970, or in the 70s, you were employed as an investment analyst at Senbank and subsequently a stockbroker for Martin & Co., now JP Morgan, during which time you completed your BA and your honours in economics, cum laude, part-time at Wits, take you back. And in 1976, your MSc in economics at the London School of Economics, followed by your PhD. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And people are in this environment trying to fathom out where we are. And what I found was most interesting, just in reading your profile, I mean, you conducted approximately 3,500 presentations to corporations and other institutions, as well as the conferences dealing with local and international economic environment. And of course, a new way of thinking for South Africans. And I think you're very passionate about that, because the question I really want to start with is, are we in recession at this moment in time?
I think we probably are in a recession, not only in South Africa, but globally. If we're not in recession right now, we're certainly going into a recession. And that is a result of the fact that there have been massive excesses in the supply of money, resulting from huge stimulus injected into the global economy over the past 2 decades, and especially over the past 2.5 years, to try and extricate consumers and businesses out of the ravages caused by lockdown. And as a consequence of these excesses, we are now seeing a massive surge in inflation, of the likes of which I haven't seen since my early days as an economist in the 1970s. Wow. Yeah. So it's in a way a déjà vu. And the unfortunate thing is that central banks around the world, including our own, are being obliged to raise interest rates in order to try and squeeze that inflation out of the system. Fortunately, in South Africa, those excesses have not been as great as they have been in some of the leading economies, such as the United States and Europe. And as a consequence, we are not suffering quite the same inflation and quite the same increase in interest rates that those countries are experiencing and are headed for into the near future as well.
We've never seen anything like this, though. I mean, we've seen interest rates slide up and down, and we'd always ask the question, is it a buyer's or seller's market? But we really are in uncharted water. This is not something we've ever seen before.
Partly the answer to that is you're quite right to some extent, in that the amount of money that has been created around the world in the last decade is unprecedented. It is massive, and it's completely out of proportion to anything that we've seen before. Similarly, the levels of debt that are being incurred are higher than we've ever seen before. And that's quite scary, because if you look at the situation without any form of creativity or ingenuity, you say, wow, the risks are of a massive depression in the global economy. But I've learned not to be that pessimistic, because every time you think the world is going to fall off a cliff, somehow man's ingenuity rescues the situation, and it doesn't turn out to be quite so bad after all.
No, absolutely. And I mean, we're optimistically positive, may I say, around this table. But you're also instrumental in helping South Africans think in a different way. And I see that you've published journals and articles on trends in South Africa, and that all blends in well to this conversation. Because when you drive around and when you talk to people, people aren't that positive. And often you beg the question, is it a way of thinking? Maybe we should become more positive. And if we all become more positive, things will happen.
Without a doubt, I think one of the important roles that I feel I have been able to play, and I'm very privileged to have been in that situation, is to try and imbue the average South African with an ability to understand and think about what is happening, to be able to formulate his own opinions about this. That doesn't mean to say that I try to paint a glowing picture around everything, but I think people feel a little more comfortable if they understand what is going on and are able to think for themselves around that.
And for the young entrepreneurial spirit that is being manifested in schools and in universities, I mean, is the sentiment optimistic? I mean, when I speak to the youngsters, I mean, they're not having our conversations. They're positive. This is the dream for them to a large. They're coming out of university, and
it's a very different world from that to in which we grew up. It's a far more digitized world.
Yes.
I find it a little awesome, I must say, and beyond my realm of thinking very often. But I admire the fact that the youth have all sorts of new ways of thinking and creating new products.
I mean, the innovation is just unbelievable.
It's unbelievable, and I feel lost very often in this kind of new world, but realize that is the way of the future, and that is what is going to that is what gives one optimism that solutions will be found to some of the problems that are being generated.
Unbelievable. And I mean, you're a language man as well. I mean, you've studied and you've learnt other languages, and of course that also helps just in being able to communicate. I often say to South Africans, you need, I mean, of 11 or 12 languages, you got to understand, and you've got to realize that people like to communicate in their mother tongue, and you've understood that to a degree.
I do appreciate that, but possibly it's one of my weaknesses. I have not learnt African languages,
yeah.
But at the same time, what I have recognized is that so many of the more educated Africans are not using their native languages anymore. They are basically communicating with each other in English all the time. That has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. And I think the same thing is happening on an international basis, where the use of English is just dominating all around the world in a manner that was previously not ever present. And I think some of us must be very grateful that that is our leading language.
Sure. And just to bring the conversation to a property portal at the moment, because we're all looking for answers, and it's almost rubbing the crystal ball, hoping that we can see into the future. I mean, is there some sort of light at the end of the tunnel when it I mean, I know what we're doing in the commercial property space, and we're often a country mile out for sellers, and buyers are we're bridging the gap. But how do you instill confidence?
The property market is extremely challenging at the moment. However, it's not the first time that it has been challenging. In the 50-odd years that I've been, well, actually 60 if I think of because I did have a little bit of history that I could look back on when I started working, we have had some huge property cycles. The boom of we had the sharp downturn after Sharpeville, then a boom during the 60s, a bit of a bust during the 70s, quite a bust actually, especially after the Soweto riots. And then the market picked up beautifully again in the late 70s, early 80s, and then had a big, went to sleep through much of the 90s. In fact, it had quite a bit of a downturn, in fact, with the uncertainty that prevailed around the transformation that we had. And then in the 2000s, of course, from around 2000 onwards, for the next 8 years, we had an unprecedented boom. And since then, since the early part of the last decade, there's been a bit of a stagnation. But I think what the property market, and one needs to distinguish between different areas of the property market. The commercial and office markets saw a massive amount of expansion of capacity a decade ago, and that created a surplus that, with the economic slowdown and growth, the slowdown in growth and the deterioration of South Africa's economic performance, has resulted in a surplus of capacity that is currently still prevalent, which was heavily exacerbated by the onset of COVID-19 and the desire of people to shop online instead of going to shopping centres, and people wanting to work at home rather than at offices. On the other hand, the industrial space has not been as badly affected, and you don't see the excesses in supply in that market to the same extent. Then on the residential side, we had this unprecedented boom 15 years ago, followed by topping out, and in many areas the market has just not moved for the last 10 years. Now, having seen these cycles in the past, one realizes that nothing stays still forever, and there's going to be a change for the better in that respect. But what's complicating it in South Africa at the moment is the completely divergent trends that we're seeing. I'm thinking, obviously, with wearing the Gauteng hat, where the market is relatively depressed still, as compared with the Western Cape and certain parts of KwaZulu-Natal, where markets have just taken off again in recent years due to semigration.
That's a big buzzword right now.
Absolutely.
People are moving down to the Cape and because they feel. But do you also find that people are living differently today? I think people have caught up with reality. They don't want maintenance. They want to live simply, live in precincts, have everything in almost walking distance.
There's been a huge change in that regard. The old syndrome of having a nice big house and so on has tended to fade, and people are preferring to, as you say, go into big complexes and estates where everything is organized, and they feel security has become a big issue in South Africa in the last 20 years.
And it's about convenience now. I mean, residentially it's about convenience and it's about practicality and mobility.
Absolutely, very much so, and being close to areas where people can shop and do stuff.
I mean, I often say to people that when we were younger, it was more difficult to spend money. It's much easier now to spend money.
That is true.
and as a result, people are convenient orientated. They are living in an environment where they want things to be dropped off, delivered, food, all items, as you say, in one place. They don't want to be inconvenienced.
The world has changed, especially in South Africa, has evolved, especially in South Africa, quite dramatically. The other challenge that the country obviously faces is the spatial problem that we have.
Yes.
In that so much of the population lives so far from its workplace, and that is bound to evolve and into a situation where people start living much closer to their workstations. And I don't know which way it's going to go, whether the office opportunities or work opportunities will move to where the people live, as opposed to people migrating to where the job opportunities are. But it's a major problem and challenge in South Africa at the moment, because many of the poor are having to spend a fortune in transport to get to work. And that's a legacy of the apartheid era, and but has to be addressed because it's contributing towards a lot of the inequality that we are seeing.
Are you able, in your crystal ball, predict in the next 2 to 3 years to where we could potentially be with all these challenges? Would they be addressed? Would transport be addressed? Would the logistical factors be addressed? Is it a bridge too far at the moment, or is it being dealt with? I mean, we talk about the ANC and their challenges and the sentiment out there.
If you're talking 2 to 3 years, I think that one must be very careful not to be overly optimistic. These massive structural challenges that the economy is facing are going to take several years to address, and we need to make progress in that regard. There have been some signs from the leadership of the ANC that they are prepared to try and tackle some of these, but they are facing a lot of a backwash from within their own party due to factionalism, and that's unlikely to be resolved immediately. It will take a good few years for that to happen. But I'm optimistic about the much longer term, beyond the next 2 to 3 years. I think we could see fairly dramatic changes in the socio-political environment that will be challenging in their own right, but may suddenly unleash enormous opportunities and economic growth. And South Africa, I think, does have the potential to really boom if and when things are done properly. The challenge that we have is that there is an ideological divide between those who believe that things need to be addressed through, that the economy needs to be enhanced through private sector involvement, get the business sector to drive things, as opposed to another faction that ideologically believes socialistically that everything needs to be driven by the state. And I think that divide needs to be resolved before we really start making progress.
Do you think that discussion and that activation will materialize under the ANC leadership, or is it a situation where we need some other force to come in?
I think it's not a case of another force. The force is already at hand, and we are seeing the ANC facing huge challenges. And I predict that from the 2024 elections, we could see significant changes in the political landscape that start unleashing some of these dynamics in a way that actually will either lead to far better growth or lead to further deterioration. And I'd like to be optimistic that the sense will prevail and we'll move towards a much higher growth plane, but not until 2024. I think there's going to be a lot of baggage that the ANC's carrying that will need to be resolved before then.
Sure. I mean, when you wake up in the morning, does it take a lot for you to be positive? Or hearing and seeing this wall, this mountain of information that gets thrown at you, you almost get the inside track.
There's no doubt. I mean, fortunately, I've lived long enough to see that there is a silver lining to every cloud, and there is a cloud at the end of every blue sky as far as the economic landscape goes. And I lived abroad. You mentioned my background, having studied for many years in England. And when I wake up in the morning in South Africa and I see the blue sky, that really does uplift me and is far more important than many of the other aspects. The temperament of South Africans, I think, is very favorable. I think they are very sociable animals compared with people overseas, and it makes it a very, very attractive location to live one's life in.
I mean, we've got this unbelievable space that we have, doesn't exist anywhere in the world. I mean, anywhere in the world you're on top of each other. The climate is something else.
It's climate, it's people, and it's claustrophobia.
Yeah.
And we have positives to speak about South Africa in every respect in those respects.
I've never met anybody that has come to South Africa that has not been blown away. And when they get to Cape Town, they say, we didn't realize you had this. When they go to the game reserves and when they see the rich history and culture.
I'd like to be even more positive, and I say, where we are right now in Johannesburg it's very beautiful. Look, not a cloud in the sky, greenery everywhere.
Most treed city in the world. At one point we were categorized.
Yes, I know. We've got a challenge there, the spora beetle. That's spreading around. Yeah.
But they still exist, and when you drive to the leafy suburbs, you realise that it's a great place.
It's a very beautiful city, far more beautiful than most people actually perceive it to be.
You presented papers to a variety of different universities, and equally to Phuket. Well, how did that come across?
I put it down. It was basically a South African company with a marketing exercise to try and incentivize its marketing team. And they held a conference at a hotel in Phuket and invited me to be the keynote speaker. That was a special one. It wasn't.
It wasn't dedicated. I thought, well, where are the similarities?
But it was a wonderful experience because 6 months later, I saw videos of that hotel completely blown away by a tsunami.
So you were there before.
I was there before.
You got in just in time.
That's right.
And then just one last point on this. We tend to bundle the economy with just the state of the world because business is different. Things operate differently now.
Unfortunately, there is a very close link between what happens in the world and what happens in South Africa.
Yeah.
And this is the avenue through which that arises is via the commodities space.
Yeah.
South Africa is highly dependent on export revenues from the sale of minerals and agricultural products, and their prices are determined by the level of economic activity globally. So we are very vulnerable to, and benefit very often, as we did last year, from the vagaries of what happens in the rest of the world. And this is one of the challenges we may be facing right now, is that last year we had, our economy was saved to some extent by the fact that the world economy boomed in terms of recovery from COVID, and commodity prices shot up, and we made huge windfalls that have helped the fiscus gain a lot more tax revenue than we ever thought we would, and prevent our public debt levels. Government has not had to borrow as much as it thought it might do so. But right now, with an impending recession globally through higher interest rates, many of these commodity prices are starting to cool down. And so that is the big challenge we've got. It's no coincidence that the rand has depreciated in the past year because of the perception that that boom phase may now be over for a while.
But still in conversation with you, you are the incorrigible optimist. You are known for that, and you're giving me confidence in this conversation to say there is a tomorrow.
There is a tomorrow, and one must bear in mind that the world goes in cycles.
Yeah.
And that is why, if you own property in the Gauteng region and you're depressed right now, do not necessarily believe that this will continue indefinitely.
Absolutely.
There will be certain developments in due course. I cannot predict exactly what they are, and suddenly this market is going to take off again.
Okay, and the benchmark is pretty much 2024.
It looks
to
like
see if there's some sort of shift.
Correct.
But of course, there are more people coming into the system. The youngsters that are being qualified, that are coming through, are just, there's so much energy and talent.
That is our saving grace, actually,
Yeah.
and that is where we need to look for optimism, is the hope that sufficient people become qualified to be able to carry us forward with the new ideas and enterprise, because probably the biggest stumbling block that the country faces right now is the relatively weak level of education around the country, which means that at the moment 15% of the youth get an excellent education and are able to contribute massively to the upliftment of the economy, but the other 85% come out of schools with very little ability to add value to the economy and to be employed.
They need to be employed to be able to do that.
That's right.
And of course, logistics, as you mentioned earlier, plays such a vital role in being able to upstart.
Yes,
get going. And
in rural areas, kids have to walk for miles to get to school.
Just your 10, 15-second take on national health care and where that is right now.
I think national health care is a non-starter right now. It's the costs involved in implementing it properly are absolutely exorbitant. The same with the concept of a basic income grant. It's just unaffordable. We need to get there little by little by improving the public healthcare system gradually. And we're a long, long way from that. In fact, public healthcare system has, if anything, been going backwards. I do not believe national health insurance is the way to go to implement it the way that it's been envisaged in the past. It has to be done in a very gradual manner and be brought in gradually.
Dr. Azar Jammine, thank you so much for spending quality time with us today on broadcast, and I hope we can do this again. And the Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix, thank you very much. It's been an honor and a privilege.
It's likewise. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.